If you want to leave a legacy that lasts, you want to do something that's so great you can't even put a dollar figure on it, you make sure that you launch those kids in such a way that long after you're gone from this planet, they'll be leading their family to love God, serve others, share their story.
Hope and encouragement for life. Hope and encouragement for life. Touching lives.
What I want to do today is I want to deal with the parents and the kids. And I want to share with you today how to help your children share their story, because I think the key to raising kids is keeping in mind the purpose of your kids is to keep sharing the story, not just your story, but their story. So I want you to write down a sentence, because this is what I want you to take out the door with you this morning. Through your children, you can launch a legacy that will last. Through your children, you can launch a legacy that will last. Now, it all involves giving your children three things that we're going to look at this morning. Number one, we need to give our children, you need to give your children spiritual direction. Now, listen again to what he says in Psalm 127, verse 3. Very interesting. Sons are a heritage from the Lord, children a reward from him. Now, the Hebrew word for heritage literally means possession or property. What that literally says is, children are the property or the possession of the Lord. The verbal form of that noun means to give, literally means to give an assignment to someone. Now, when you think of it that way, that puts children in a totally different light. Children are a property of the Lord. What that means is children are not just born from below, they're given from above. They're really literally on loan to you. Your children really belong to God. They're his property and they're his possession. Now you say, well, why is that such a big deal? Well, let me just make a real practical political application. What that means, Planned Parenthood, is there's no such thing as an unwanted child. And what that means, Planned Parenthood, is there's no such thing as a, quote, illegitimate child. Because every child that comes is conceived in the womb ought to be allowed to be brought into this world, because every child is a wanted child. You say, well, who wants the child? God wants the child. And every child has a legitimate purpose for living given by God himself. That's why he calls children a reward. Do you see that word? Children are a reward. They're not just the result of a one-time biological act. They're not just a tax deduction. They're not just another chair at the kitchen table. They're far more than what people call a nuisance, because if you understand what children really are, Solomon said, you'll understand your children are a reward to you. They're a loving reward from a loving God. And to put it in perspective, think about this. God took 6 days to create the world. He takes 9 months to create a child. That'll tell you something. 6 days to create the world, 9 months to design a child. And then Solomon makes a very interesting comparison. Look in verse 4. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are sons born in one's youth. I find that interesting. And I also find it very wise and apropos. Solomon compares children to arrows. Makes sense. You ever wanted to shoot one of your kids out your window? He says, yeah, they're just like arrows. Now, I'm not an archer. Anybody deer hunt out there with bows? How many bow hunters we got out there? All right, we got a few. Some of you hunt deer, so you know a little bit. I've never really shot a bow, but I know enough about an arrow to know that an arrow has to fulfill 2 purposes, or else the arrow is useless. Number 1, it's got to be shot in the right direction, and number 2, it's got to hit the right target. Now, what is true of an arrow is true of children. I want you to listen. I'm going to throw this up on the screen. I want you to listen to this. Our job as parents is to make sure from the time our children are born, they are shot in a godly direction and they hit the target of having a relationship with God. Now, that thought alone ought to tell you just how precious your children really are. If you're a parent this morning, I wrote down a list of things that you can't take with you when you die. You can't take your wealth, your house, your 401k, your bank account, your cars, your boats, your stocks, your bonds, your real estate. But you can take your children. I'm taking mine. And you can take your children. And one other thing, by the way, remember he says they're not just arrows, they're arrows in the hands of a warrior. Now, why does he add? He didn't have to add that detail. Why does Solomon say, no, I don't want you just to have the picture of your children being arrows. I want you to picture you're a warrior, and you're the one with the arrow in your hand. Now, why does he give us that metaphor? Where does a warrior get an arrow? I mean, he doesn't pick them from trees. He doesn't harvest them from the ground. Arrows come from trees, but they don't grow on trees. Now, do you know what an arrow used to be? You ever thought about it? You know what an arrow used to be? An arrow used to be just a plain old stick. What a warrior would do is he would go to a tree, cut some wood from that tree, pare it down in the shape of a smooth stick, and then he would do the three things that you've got to do with a stick to turn it into an arrow. You've got to make it pointed, you've got to make it polished, and then you've got to propel it. Got to be pointed, polished, and propelled. That's what you do to make an arrow. And what Solomon is saying is, look, your child is born a stick. Your job as a parent is to turn that child into an arrow. So you're to continuously set your children straight so you can shoot your children straight, so you can shoot straight with your children. The problem is, and this is what really gets me, the tragedy is we've got a nation filled with children who are never aimed anywhere. They're given no spiritual direction at all. They're launched, but they're never aimed. And the average child in this nation gets basically no spiritual direction from the average parent. You remember that little poem that we learned when we were kids? I guess you learned it. I shot an arrow into the air. And how does it go? And where it landed, I know not where. Some of y'all need to go back to school, all right? I shot an arrow into the air. Where it landed, I know not where. Now, I'm going to say something that may offend some of you, and I don't mean to offend you, but I believe it, and I stand by it. I want to say it to you. It is better for parents not to have children than to have children and not do everything they can to teach them to love God, serve others, and share their story. I believe that. Let me tell you, if you don't have any children and you don't intend to fulfill your spiritual obligation to do everything you can to launch that child in the direction they ought to go and do everything you can to make sure they hit the bullseye of having a relationship with God, it would be better for you not to have children. Isaiah 38:19 says this, one generation makes known your faithfulness to the next. And what Isaiah was saying was families are kind of like relay teams. And the job of the mom and the dad is to pass the God baton to the hand of the son and the daughter. That son and the daughter, in turn, is to hand the God baton to the grandson and the granddaughter. And the grandson and the granddaughter, their job is to take the God baton and make sure they pass it down to the next generation. In other words, what Solomon was saying was, as a mom and a dad, you're just a link in this long chain. And you better remember this when you're training your children, because when you train your children, listen to this. I've learned this now. I've learned this the hard way with Harper. You're not just training your children. You're training your children on how they're going to train their children. And guess what? They're going to train their children on how to train their children. So in a sense, you're not just raising your own children, you are raising future generations, because the way you raise your child is the way they're going to raise their child by and large. And the way they raise that child is the way the next child is going to be raised. And it's the way you continuously share your story. So as I was thinking about this, I thought, okay, what are some practical tips that I could give parents on how to give their kids spiritual direction? And I'm just going to give you a few. These are just some that work for us. I'll just give you a few. Begin when they're young and read Bible stories to them at bedtime, nap time, and mealtime. By the way, we do this. We kept Harper yesterday. We went over and picked up Harper, and so he came home, and nap time was, yesterday afternoon. He always wants Pop to put him, down for a nap, which is always good because he always puts me to sleep. So I went upstairs, and he already knows what we're going to do. I got this Bible story book, and we're going to read through. I'm starting in the very first. We're going to start with creation. Going to go all the way through this Bible story book. So we started reading about creation, and I read the story of creation to him. Of course, it's got little pictures and cartoons and all that kind of stuff. So then, he went to sleep, and about an hour and a half later, he gets up, come downstairs, right out of the blue. Out of the blue, he's sitting there, and I give him a little treat for, being a sweet boy. And so he's eating that treat, and he says, "Pop," I said, "What?" He said, "Jesus made the birds." I said, "That's right. And Jesus made you and me." "Right." And Jesus made the fishies in the creek. I said, right. And he made the shrimps that we eat. I said, that's right. He made all those things. Now, here's a little 3-year-old boy. I'll read one little story to him, and it's already sticking like glue. That's one thing you can do. Here's another one. Let them hear you pray for them to know God in their life. I mean, from the time they're young, Lord, I want to pray for John. I want to pray for Harper. I want to pray for Greg. I want to pray for Teresa. I want to pray for Sam. Lord, I pray when the time is right that my little son, my little daughter will come to know God in their life. Here's another one. As you take them to church, explain what the various rituals, Lord's Supper, baptism, explain what they really mean. I can still remember going to that little country church not 40 miles from here, and the first time they took the Lord's Supper, and I couldn't take the Lord's Supper because I had not, become a believer. And I remember asking my daddy, why can't I do this? I mean, that looks good to me. I like grape juice, and I like bread, and, why can't I do this? And I remember my dad taking me home and sitting and explaining to me what that meant. Tell them the real meaning of Easter and Christmas early. Emphasize that Easter is primarily about Jesus and his resurrection, not the Easter bunny. And Christmas is primarily about the birth of Jesus, not Santa Claus. Now here's a biggie. Be sensitive to every spiritual question they ask and take time to answer those questions thoroughly. I have watched parents get asked questions, really good questions by their children. I mean, really perceptive. And because they don't know the Bible like they ought to know the Bible, they just kind of blow their kids off. And so I want to encourage you, if you get stumped by your child, don't swallow your ego, admit it, and just say, you know what, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to find the answer to that, or do what I'd always do, go ask your mother. But make sure that they get some kind of an answer to the question. Here's another one. Buy Christians DVDs, or even I believe in biblical cartoons. They make wonderful biblical cartoons that present biblical truths. And here's one more. Find a time every day. For us, it was at the breakfast table. That was our easiest time to do it, where you can study a passage of the Bible together. That's what we did every day. That was we all knew we had breakfast. We didn't know we'd all be together at lunch or all be together at dinner. We'd all be together at breakfast. So every day we would study a passage of the Bible together. The point I want you to understand is this. The picture I want you to get in your mind right now is this. You're the warrior. You've got the bow. Your child is the arrow. You're going to determine how that child is polished. You're going to determine how that child is pointed. And you're going to determine where that child is propelled, because I want you to understand, please hear this. Somebody's going to determine how your child is polished. If you don't, somebody will. Somebody's going to determine how your child is pointed. If you don't, somebody will. And somebody's going to decide where your child is propelled, and if you don't, somebody will. So you give your child spiritual direction. Number 2, give your child loving discipline. Now, I want to keep this arrow analogy going because you know, again, if you're an archer, you know this. One of the things you have to have on an arrow is you got to have feathers. And not only do you have to have feathers, they have to be straight. Because if you don't have feathers and you don't have straight feathers, then the arrow will not fly straight. And you also know sometimes the tip of the blunt will become dull, and sometimes you have to sharpen the tip of that blunt. Well, the same thing is true for children. Sometimes their feathers have to be straightened. And that means sometimes your feathers have to get ruffled. I mean, sometimes you have to discipline your children. Sometimes they need the blunt of their tip sharpened. So at the risk of walking into some very controversial territory, and I realize going against a lot of what some child-rearing experts and child psychologists are saying today, I want to just let you know, and I'd be unfaithful to God's word if I didn't tell you this, the Bible is very clear about disciplining children. And the Bible is also very clear about doing it early. Now, let me tell you the good news. The good news is the old saying, spare the rod, spoil the child, is not in the Bible. A lot of people think that, but that saying's not in the Bible. Whether you think it's true or not, it is not in the Bible. However, let me tell you the other side. The Bible is even stronger than that. Here's what the Bible says in Proverbs 13, verse 24. He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is careful to discipline him. Proverbs 22:15. Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline will drive it far from him. And you know, all God asks of parents is simply one thing. He says, I want you to discipline your children the way I discipline mine. Well, you say, how does God discipline his? Proverbs 3:11 and 12 says this, my son, listen. When the Lord punishes you, do not give up when he tells you what you must do. The Lord punishes everyone he loves. Now listen to this. He whips every son he receives. And I don't know about you, I've had my share. I've been to God's woodshed. And he whips. I'm just telling you now, he does. And discipline applied lovingly according to the Bible is one of the greatest ways you can love a child. Dr. James Dobson puts it this way. The parent must convince himself that punishment is not something he does to the child. It is something he does for the child. His attitude toward a disobedient child is this: I love you too much to let you behave like that. And understand, the Bible's it emphasizes you do it when they're young. Now, I thought about that. Why is the Bible so adamant when it says, if you're going to discipline your kids, start early or just forget it? Let me tell you something I learned the other day, fascinated me. You can take a young child, I'm talking about even a preschooler, but you can take a young child and you can teach that child perfect Spanish, perfect Chinese, perfect Russian, any other language you want to teach. And here's what the amazing thing is. They not only can learn that language, they can speak it without even the trace of an accent. They can perfectly replicate the same way a child who is native to that language can speak. The flip side of that is, though, let that child wait until they're 20 years old and then try to teach them a totally, completely different language, and it's almost impossible for them to approximate exactly the same sound that is made by the natives of a particular language. Well, researchers have now learned why that's true. This is kind of interesting to me. It's a process that's known as PHONEME, phoneme attraction. Here's what they've learned. When you're born, your larynx is very, very soft. It's almost like silly putty. And you can shape your larynx to make about any sound that you want that larynx to make. And that's why you can teach a child multiple languages at the same time. They can pick up on it just like that, and they can speak it fluently, just like they were born in that country. They can do it with 3 or 4 or 5 different languages. But as we get older, guess what happens to that larynx? It begins to harden. It begins to get set. And it makes it almost impossible or very difficult to make other sounds later in life. In other words, there's this brief window of opportunity when anything is possible linguistically for a child. I learned that when I was in Nicaragua last week. I'm trying to be cool and, I'm trying to kind of be hip with the, language down there. And I'm going down there, Buenas tardes. And they're looking at me like, dude, what is Buenas tardes? I mean, and I'm exaggerating, but the point is I can't totally really replicate what they do anymore. My larynx is hardened. Well, here's the difference. Your child's attitude toward authority is just like their larynx. When you first start out with them, they listen, and they're highly respectful. And they, in fact, they really hunger for authority, and you've got that brief opportunity during late infancy and toddlerhood when respect can still be instilled, and that type of attitude won't last very long. Now, you may be one of those parents and you say, I don't care what you say, I don't care what God's Word says, I don't care what God says. I do not believe in spanking, I don't believe in using any kind of a rod or anything like that at all. Look, I'm not going to argue with you, so don't send me your emails or your letters. I don't have to answer for you as a parent, it's your child. Here's your problem. If you decide that you're going to take spanking completely out of your toolbox, then most of the time, here's what you're left with: nagging, begging, belittling, and yelling. And that's why God talks about the rod. Now, I want to make sure you understand. I'm about to leave here misunderstanding what I'm saying. When I'm talking about this type of discipline, I'm talking about what's useful with toddlers and preschoolers up to about 6 years of age. I'm not talking about physical abuse. There's big differences. When I talk about even a spanking, I mean, 1 or 2 spanks to the buttocks with some kind of an object that doesn't do any kind of deep physical harm. Spanking, let me tell you the worst thing. My mother used to use a hickory switch. Now, some of you don't even know what a hickory switch is, okay? I understand that. If you don't know what it is, give God thanks every day. Nothing worse than that. But the point is this. Spanking has the intent of just trying to correct a behavioral problem. Abuse has the intent to do physical harm by violent action. And the attitude's totally different. When you spank a child or discipline a child in that way, you do it out of love and you do it out of concern. Physical abuse, you're just trying to hurt the child. You're trying to do physical damage to that child out of anger and malice. So just to make sure there's no misunderstanding, I'm about to leave here thinking I'm saying anything more than what I'm saying. Let me give you these guidelines, all right? Just a few. Number one, spanking should be used selectively for clear, deliberate disobedience and misbehavior. It must be caused by a persistent defiance of the parent's instruction. I'll give you an example. You don't spank a child because they spill their milk. You don't spank a child because they honestly forgot to do something. It's for willful disobedience. Here's another one. Use other forms of discipline first. Verbal correction, time out, sitting in a corner, watching Florida football, something, while carefully explaining that the next action will draw a spanking. You use diplomacy first. Here's another one. Spanking is generally inappropriate before 15 months of age and usually not necessary after 6 years of age and should rarely be used after the age of 9 or 10. Spanking should always be a planned action, not just a reaction. It should only come after the child has been forewarned, and this is important. The child should clearly understand why he or she is being spanked. That's big. Do you understand why I'm doing this? Do you understand why you're being punished? And here's the last one. Spanking should always be administered in private, never to publicly humiliate. Never. You give your children loving discipline. And then here's the last thing, real quick. This is short. Give your children emotional development. Now let me stay with me. After you polish the arrow, you sharpen the arrow. Because if you don't sharpen that arrow, it won't do what it was intended to do. And God wants us to sharpen our children. He wants us to develop our children emotionally. Because once again, you've got to begin early. Because when you realize, listen to this, 60 to 65% of your child's vocabulary is acquired by the age of 3. 80% of their character is formed by the age of 5. 90% of their personality is set by the age of 7. And what I want you parents to understand and grandparents to understand is you've got this real small window of opportunity when you can shape that child and form that child and develop that child, and then that child is gone. So I just want to kind of wrap all this up with a couple of things and we'll be done. I want to talk to dads for 1 minute. Not that I'm discounting moms, because moms do what I'm going to tell the dads that they need to do. Dads, the one thing you've got to give your children, if you're going to give them the emotional development that they need, you've got to give them your time. You've got to get nothing. There's no substitute for your time. Not gifts, not money, nothing. There's no substitute for your time. Let me tell you why this is so important. Recent survey, they discovered in Russia, the average father spends as much as 2 to 3 hours a day with their children. In the United States, fathers on average spend 37 minutes a day with their children. Only 15 minutes a week in any kind of meaningful conversation. Parents spend less time with their children in America than any other developed country in the world. So you take time with your kids and you make time for your kids. So I'll just close with one little thing, just kind of a practical thing that we did. As a pastor, particularly, pastoring, I'm sure you know, it's a 7-day-a-week job. I quote unquote take Fridays off, but I work on Fridays. I mean, I do email, I get phone calls. You can't tell people on Friday, you can't die today. You can't get sick today. I mean, this doesn't work. It's kind of like being a doctor. So every Friday night, we made Friday night family night. That was, so and what we did was real simple. Every family member took turns. I took my turn, Teresa took her turn, James, Jonathan, Joshua, they took turns. And on every family night, the family member that was their night, anything they wanted, that's what we did. They decided everything, what restaurant we'd eat at, what activity we'd do, what movie we'd go see, whatever they wanted to do. Now, I dreaded Jonathan's night. Dreaded it. I'm not kidding, I dreaded it. Can I tell you why? I'm not making this up. He would always pick out the most expensive restaurant we could find. And then when we would go, he wouldn't look at the food, he just looked at the dollar sign, and he always picked out the most expensive thing on the menu. And then he would always think of the most expensive action or the most expensive thing that we could do together as a family. Now, come to think of it, some kids never grow up. But here's the point. When I say family night, we made family night, and we were together every family night. That's the way it works. So I want to close with this. If you're a parent, you've been so blessed. God has chosen to put in your quiver arrows. And you've got both the freedom and the responsibility to put that arrow in your bow, and you can point that arrow anywhere you want to point it or not point it anywhere at all. You can just shoot it up into the air, and where it lands, you know not where. But I want to say it again. If you don't point your kids somewhere, somebody's going to point them for you. And if you don't polish your kids the way they ought to be polished, somebody's going to do it for you, and they're going to be propelled in some direction. And I'm telling you, and I'm saying this now as a dad looking back, if you want to leave a legacy that lasts, you want to do something that's so great you can't even put a dollar figure on it, you make sure that you launch those kids in such a way that long after you're gone from this planet, they'll be leading their family to love God, serve others, share their story.
Being a parent is a job that never stops. It can be the most rewarding experience, but it can also be overwhelming at times. If your parenting duties are getting the best of you and you find yourself struggling today, call Touching Lives. We want to encourage you, and someone is waiting to pray with you right now. It's been said that children are on loan from God, and we know from His Word that they have His purpose. Through your children, you can launch a legacy that will last. Learn how to prepare your children with the series Family Reunion. Dr. Merritt outlines how to give your children the spiritual direction, loving discipline, and emotional development they need to become a legacy of faith. Order your copy of this series today. CDs $25, DVDs $45 at touchinglives.org or call us toll-free at 1-800-413-1131. Now, a look at the next Touching Lives.
If all of a sudden, people who came to church on Sunday morning started going back to their neighborhoods and their offices and their schools and really started living like they believe what they say they believe, you'd see a revolution in this country.
It's no secret that parents, whether very present or quite absent, have the greatest impact on a child. It's hard work, and it never ends. At Touching Lives, we want to be a resource for parents as they take on the most important job they'll ever have, raising their children. And this ministry continues to serve families because of the faithful prayers and financial support of our donors. Thank you.